Okay, and for study goals 15 and 16, I normally have a big slideshow that I show you in class, but I'm going to ask you to pause this video and do a couple of Google image searches as you go. I want to talk about the impact of mining practices. There's a few types of mining that I want to mention, but as a general rule, there's a couple of generalities I'd like you to note. First, all types of mining have become far larger in impact. Historically, mining was done manually. You may know the Zoolander references of like people with pickaxes, like creeping through dripping tunnels with like hard hats and like a candle and like a cage with a canary. That type of mining is basically extinct globally, pretty much everywhere. There's a teeny bit of what you might call subsistence manual mining. A couple of places on tropical islands where people dig holes to dig for stuff by hand, but pretty much all the world's mining now is done by very well trained operators that use really big machines, and the machines have become really, really big. This is probably the right time. Why don't you get ready to pause and go to a Google image search for large mining equipment? And you'll see huge trucks and huge excavators and huge scoops. And the basic concept there is that those machines, even though they cost $1 million each, they replace thousands of workers' hourly wages for months or years. The machines are very, very complex and expensive, but running a few machines is still way more profitable than paying a whole bunch of miners. So the first thing that I wanted to highlight is that globally mining has become a much larger scale. We've invented machinery that we can run on fossil fuels, and as we've discussed previously in the class, a gallon of fossil fuels costs much less than its labor equivalent. A gallon of gasoline can basically equal 10 to 20 hours of human labor. And so you can replace 10 or 20 hours of wages with, $3 of gasoline cost today, and that's at US prices. The second trend that I wanted to mention is that underground mining, where you dig a tunnel to go work in a little tube, the way that termites tunnel their way through wood. Tunneling actually has a really small impact because you're only moving the stuff that was inside the tunnel to reach your product. Underground mining is usually really low impact. In all the impacts that mining has, underground mining has less impact, but it's much more expensive, it's more laborious, and it's more dangerous. So all modern mining is trying to find a way to replace underground mining with some sort of surface mining where you can just get rid of everything in the way to reach that product. Instead of tunneling down to it, you just get rid of all the dirt above it. Because this little tunnel is really expensive and really sketchy and really laborious, but this huge excavation is just a couple of big machines to move all that dirt out of the way. There are 5 types of mining that I'd like to recommend, that I'd like to describe. Placer mining, underground mining, open pit, strip, and mountaintop removal. I'd like you to find pictures for each of these as I go in order. Placer mining, you could stop and look for some photographs now. Placer, Placer, is how we get the stuff that's carried by water. So, for things that have a very different density than others, like water will drop a whole bunch of gravel, and if you think of a rock that big, that would fall as gravel. If gold was mixed in with those rocks, it would be a teeny little pellet because gold is very dense and heavy. So placer mining is when you go through placer deposits where the product you're looking for has a big difference in density with the stuff around it. Placer mining is looking through placer deposits, usually on the banks of a river or a place where a river used to be. So maybe during the last ice age, there was a river here, even though now it's a desert. And those placer deposits would stay there. Placer mining is looking through placer deposits. And the big harm with placer mining is the impact on habitat. A lot of deforestation is involved because there's a lot of rivers in the tropics. And there's usually a lot of sediment pollution in water. Placer mining is where we get most of the world's illegal gold. Placer mining is really common for diamonds as well. Underground mining is how we get lead, copper, heavy metals, and coal. Underground mining is where you dig a little tunnel, and back in the day, you would send some people with pickaxes and donkeys to pull the carts. Now we send large excavators that make giant tunnels in the ground. Those giant holes in the ground, of course, they want to fill up with water. And so you're always pumping water out, and you're always contaminating groundwater below those mines. So underground mines have a lot of groundwater and surface water impact. They tend to have a very small surface habitat cost. It's just a hole in the ground. And so at the point where you enter the ground, it's actually not a big disruption. Underground mines have the smallest habitat impact because you're just making a teeny little hole. But they do generate surface water and groundwater impacts because everything that you take out creates acid mine drainage. We've talked about that. And any water that gets into that can contaminate groundwater. Underground mining is by far the most dangerous because, of course, that's a sketchy place to be when something goes wrong. You don't want to be underneath all that rock. A lot of times it falls because of gravity. And, of course, fires in underground mines can also be really dangerous. So underground mining probably has the smallest environmental impact and is probably the most expensive and dangerous, so it's the least practiced in large scale. You could do a quick search for open pit mines, and if you Google largest or Utah open pit mines, you'll find some big holes in the ground. And if you look at those, you can see that they're carved into the ground in these like spiraling roads that go down, and they excavate a layer from the cone and throw that out, and they excavate another layer from the cone and they throw that out. But I challenge you to put that into a useful scale. Like if you see a mining truck, I want you to Google around for images of a mining truck next to a Toyota Tacoma or like a Ford F-150 or something. Because the scale will trick your eyes. You'll see that spiraling road and you'll see a mining truck driving down that. And so you try to contextualize that in your brain based on the trucks that you know. But when you realize that a mining truck is gigantic, like a 6-story building, then all of a sudden it makes that hole appear much larger. Open pit mines are the most productive. They're how we get a lot of valuable metals today, valuable stones, precious stones. And open pit mines are notorious for their regional impacts. They basically ruin the whole watershed because of the volume of sediment pollution and the changes that they create to surface water. Strip mining is when you excavate relatively shallow but really, really big areas. You could go Google a couple of images for strip mining, and strip mining is primarily for coal. So you may want to Google coal strip mines, United Kingdom, because I guess the UK invented strip mining. This is how we get most of the US coal, and globally how we get most of the coal. And strip mines are notorious for their large-scale habitat impacts. The type of mining that is most remarkable, though, is mountaintop removal. Those pictures are really hard to find because they're like landscape changes. In the United States, we figured out sometime in the 60s and 70s that instead of trying to dig a whole layer of sediment, it's easier to just explode the whole mountaintop, scrape it into neighboring rivers, and then you're just left with the whole layer of coal. It's tough to see this in these pictures. Usually, I think my class lecture would be better for this part. But mountaintop removal was basically illegal because it had such large impacts on surface water. You can imagine that when you remove a mountaintop and you're going to topple it, that has to go somewhere, and so that would fill in river valleys. There was a really famous reinterpretation of the Clean Water Act, which made a brief period. We had one presidency that allowed mountaintop removal permits. And so for about 8 years, we sold off all these permits to all these companies that removed mountaintops to sell the coal. And at the end of that presidency, the Supreme Court decided that that was not a fair interpretation of the Clean Water Act. Mountaintop removal is again illegal. But it is kind of fascinating to know that it happened for a while. It was, for a brief period, a very lucrative way to get tremendous amounts of coal with just a few people working. You may want to take a few minutes to go look at pictures of placer mining, underground mining, open pit mining, strip mining, and mountaintop removal. I'll come back later to discuss processing of ore.